Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities. Yaroslav. During the rule of Yaroslav the Wise, Kiev reached the height of its heyday. It was then that the city's infrastructure was formed, and to this day it can still be seen in the city's general plan. The river Pachina, which now has disappeared, used to be the Dnipro's tributary, forming a cozy bay. It can be easily said that initially Kiev was not built on the Dnipro but on Pachina. Here Podil appeared with its houses and workshops of craftsmen. In the heart of Podil lay the Great Market, which spanned from the modern trade square to Zhitny Market. The trade activities began from boats in the bay and continued farther in the countless shops. Merchants came from Smolensk, Novgorod, Chernihiv, Byzantium, Near East and Europe. Conspiracies also sprang up from the square. After holding their council, the dissented merchants streamed their anger at feudal lords, and even the walls of Upper City could not hold them back. This was the case in the years 1068 and 1146. The Upper City was divided by walls and fortifications into the city of Volodymyr, the city of Yaroslav, and the city of Izaslav. The wall with 3 gates surrounded the city of Volodymyr. One of the gates led to Podil near the modern Andriivska church. The second, Sofievsky gate, opened to a grass field, while the third gate, later Mikhailivsky gate, led to the modern Mikhailivsky temple. The center of the city of Volodymyr was the Desatinna Church, the first stone temple in Kievan Rus. Volodymyr gave 1/10 of his treasury for its construction and upkeep. A team of 4 bronze horses was put in front of the temple. They were brought by the prince from Korsun. 3 palaces, boyar residences, and a trade square filled the nearby space. The city of Yaroslav was conceived by a joint effort of builders from all over Rus. Its fortifications and ramparts enclosed a territory 10 miles larger than that of the city of Volodymyr. An essential element of planning was the road which led from the temple of Sofia to the main gate of the city, the Golden Gate, with a built-in temple. The southern part of the city ended in Lyatsky Gate, near the Khrushchaty Creek, the place of modern Mikhailivska Street and Mikhailivska Square. In the north, the city could be entered through the gate later known as Lviv Gates, now an intersection of Artem and Observatorna streets. From these gates, a street ran to the capital's main square. Velika Zhytomyrska Street used to run along the inner side of the rampart. The architectural center of the city was St. Sophia Cathedral, with a monumental Georgievsky temple near it. An intersection of modern Irininska and Volodymyrska streets housed a stone temple. Houses of boyars, Putyata, Borislav, and Hlib stood nearby. A great Yaroslav yard grew in the city of Volodymyr, leading from Desatinna Church to Trochsvetitelska Church. Its vast territory allowed to arrange tournaments for horse riders. Izaslav, the son of Yaroslav, built up his part of the city near Volodymyrska mountain. He was the first to build patrimonial monasteries, among which were Dmitrievsky Temple and later Mikhailivsky Temple erected by Svyatopolk. A road led from Lyatsky Gates through Khrushchaty Yar across the bridge, now Hrushevsko Street. A ferry used to go across the Dnipro from Hungarian mountain. Here, near the grave of Askold, the church of St. Michael was built. At the side of Hungarian mountain was the place of royal residence Berestova, where Volodymyr Svyatoslavich died in the year 1015. Only the Berestov Salvation Church remained from that time until now as part of Pechersk Lavra. The history of Lavra is tightly connected with Varangian caves. In 1051, in a cave earlier built by Ilarion, Antony, a monk from Lubitsch, founded a monastery of distant caves. Eventually, he built another cave for himself on a nearby hill. As he gathered more disciples, the underground monastery of near caves was born. So began a long history of Uspensky-Pechersky Monastery, which has had a great impact on the development of Russian and Ukrainian culture. In that monastery, which was center of education, books were hand-copied, works of ancient and Byzantine authors were kept, and local chronicles were written. All our knowledge of ancient Kievan Rus we owe to one of the monks of Pechersk Monastery, Nestor the Chronicler, whose written chronicles date back to the year 1113. 3 kilometers away from Lavra, on the banks of the Libid River, currently Druzhby Narodov Boulevard, within the prince's hunting grounds, stood Zverinetsky Monastery. Vidobitsky Monastery and Mikhailivsky Temple were also built there by Vsevolod Yaroslavovich in 1070. There, in the 12th century, the right bank of the river was fortified with strong support walls, which received much praise of the contemporaries. Beginning of the 13th century saw Kiev as one of the greatest cities of Europe, with blooming trade and organized infrastructure. In those times, the city housed around 400 churches, 8 market squares, and more than 50,000 inhabitants. In this regard, some historians mention the number 100,000. Most European capitals reached the limit of 50,000 people only 200 or 300 years later. For comparison, in London, by that time lived only 20,000 people. Meanwhile, Kievan Rus was infected by civil strife. The last attempt to unite all the lands within the state was made by Pereyaslav Prince Volodymyr Monomach, grandson of Yaroslav, in the year 1113. After his death, Kievan Rus began its final disintegration into smaller states. In the fall of 1240, the Golden Horde of Batey Khan arrived at the gates of Kiev. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, the Horde. The tradition to give lands to offsprings was established by Prince Sviatoslav. He could not realize the set outcome it would lead to in just 100 years. Until the middle 12th century, Kievan Rus disintegrates into many smaller principalities. The situation could not go unnoticed by adversaries. In the beginning of the 13th century, alarming news started coming from the eastern borders. Tatar-Mongol tribes appear at the state border. In the year 1223, the Battle of River Kalka resulted in a crushing defeat of Ruses. Kiev alone lost about 10,000 warriors. In 1239, the spearhead Mongol regiments headed by Mengu Khan appeared at the left bank of the Dnipro, near Kiev. Stricken by the city's grandeur, the Khan sent an envoy to Prince Mikhail of Vsevolodych with an offer to surrender the city peacefully. The offer was declined, although the prince, sensing danger, fled to Hungary. Mengu Khan's army did not dare to attack the city. They retreated to join the bulk of Batey's forces. In 1240, the throne was seized by Danilo Halitsky, who set his vassal Dmitro at the hand of Kiev. In the fall the same year, countless hordes headed by Batey Khan crossed the Dnipro and seized the city of Kiev. The chronicles speak of such great masses of enemy that the city folks could not hear their voices for the creaking of carts, neighing of horses and bellowing of camels. The city defense coordinator was Dmitro. Resistance of the city was so fierce that the Khan was forced to give rest to his army. With the help of battering rams, Mongols managed to break the defense at Lyatsky gates. Near these gates lay impassable thicket of Khreshchatitska valley. Under the cover of dark forest, the enemy managed to gather significant forces there. They rammed the gates and hit the breastwork with catapults. The Tatars finally climbed up the rampart. The leader Dmitro was heavily wounded in the battle. Kievets managed to throw back the enemy and fortify the city of Volodymyr in the course of one night. The next day the assault continued. Upon breaking into the city, the enemy could not seize it at once for multiple lines of defense. But on December the 6th, 1240, the Golden Horde conquered the city. Despite heroic resistance, the invaders broke through the St. Sophia gates and rushed into Volodymyr's city. According to Pskov Chronicles, the city held defense for 10 weeks and 4 days. The last stronghold of the remaining defenders of Kiev was the Desetina church. Women, children and elderly took the last stand there. The church was overcrowded with people, some even tried to dig an underground passage to the mountain slope. At last, the temple fell under the blows of enemy rams. The last defenders, as well as those who hid, all were buried under rubble. Mongols, angered by such fierce resistance, burned almost the entire city and its inhabitants, including children and the old. The modern archaeologists found common graves full of defenders of the city. One of them, containing more than 2,000 skeletons, was found in Podil. The second grave, near the ramparts of Volodymyr city, contained a layer of bones half-meter thick and 14 meters wide. No more than 2,000 people remained after Batey's massacre. Kiev almost ceased to exist. A historical reference. In the year 1240, Kiev inhabited about 50,000 people, or 100,000 according to other sources. After the destruction by Batey Khan, it took almost 6 centuries to make it 50,000 once again. Only in 1845, the population of Kiev reached that number. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities. The Lithuanian period. The destruction of Kiev by the Tatar-Mongol hordes held back the city's development for almost a century. 6 years after the city fell, Plana Karpini, the Pope's legate in Mongolia, reported about 200 homesteads within its walls. Beginning of 14th century, the Lithuanian Prince Gediminas had finally captured the Belarusian lands and began taking over the territories belonging to modern Ukraine. His son Olgerd, in the year 1362, captured Kiev, and after he defeated the Golden Horde in 1363, near river Sinyuha, 60 kilometers away from modern Pervomaisk, he took the power over the most of the former Kievan Rus. The city folks welcomed the Lithuanians as their liberators from the dreaded Tatars. Their coming was not regarded as a conquest, but as a penetration. The Lithuanians' motto was, "We don't change the old ways, we don't force the new ways." Kiev and its suburbs became the vassalage of the great Lithuanian prince. Kiev had an army not big enough to defend the old upper ramparts on their full length. Therefore, the city's citadel, its stronghold, was moved from the old Kievan plateau to the high, solitary standing mountain, which rose 80 meters above Podil. Most probably here the new fort was built at the time of Prince Volodymyr Olgerdovich, hence the name of the mountain itself, Zamkova. That time was also marked by a significant economic growth of the city, although the population suffered from frequent outbursts of plague. The epidemic of 1366 was particularly harsh. All the city's nobles left Kiev for 2 years. In 1470, Lithuanian feudal lords abolished Kievan feudal principality and established Kievan military province. In 1482, Kiev was attacked and utterly destroyed by the hordes of Crimean Mangli-Girey Han. Lots of people were slain and part was taken captive to Crimea. Kiev-Pechersk monastery was destroyed and pillaged, while many monks were killed. All Kievan temples were also plundered. For 70 years, the banks of the Dnipro stood desolated until the middle of the 16th century. In order to revive the economy of desolated lands, in 1494 to 1497, Kiev was granted the Magdeburg right by the great Lithuanian Prince Alexander Kazimierovich. The right allows the city to govern itself as well as to buy goods at lower prices from merchants passing through the city. Until now, a monument to Magdeburg right can be found in Kiev. With time, Kiev became one of the biggest centers of international trade. In the 16th century, the city hosted Armenian, Genoa, Greek trade colonies, as well as trade houses of Moscow, Polish and Turkish merchants. During the 15th century, a new class of people was formed in Kiev, the Cossacks. In the middle of that century, the governor prohibited Cossacks from living within the city walls. Cossacks built their dwellings on a free land not far from the city, which until now bears the name of Kurenivka. The census of the year 1571 registered 40,000 houses in Kiev. The most actively populated district was Pechersk, mostly the lands bordering on the monastery. The amount of craftsmen grew to more than 100. Among them, the most advanced were the arrow makers. Their arrows, notable for their steel tips and eagle feathers, were exchanged by Crimean Tatars at a rate of 3 carts of salt for 10 arrows. In the first half of the 18th century, the upper city was rigorously renovated. By the middle of the 17th century, the city had 4 temples. Dominican monastery was also founded there, and by 1647, the Jesuits established their collegium. A great role in Kievan culture and education in the first half of the 17th century was played by the Metropolitan Highest Priest Petro Mohyla. It was he who initiated restoration of Sofia and Uspensky cathedrals, along with other historical places. He also founded the first Kievan Academy, the Kiev Mohyla Academy, based in Podil. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev.